That baby isn't mine.
I never betrayed you. Probability of paternity, 99.999%.
Screaming echoed through our kitchen as my husband hurled the medical envelope across the granite island. "That baby isn't mine," he roared, veins bulging in his neck. I knew I had been completely faithful, but I had no idea those test results were about to dismantle his entire bloodline. To understand the absolute devastation of that moment, you have to understand the life Alfeo and I had built, or rather, the life I thought we had built. My name is Charlene Stewart, and for 5 years, I played the role of the perfect wife in the affluent, manicured suburb of Lake Forest, Illinois. Alfeo was a third-generation real estate developer, the golden child of Charles and Margaret Stewart, a couple whose old money and societal influence loomed over our marriage like a heavy, suffocating shadow. I was a public school teacher from a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland. From the day Alfeo put the 2-carat diamond on my finger, his mother Margaret made it abundantly clear that my primary, perhaps only, value to their dynasty was my ability to provide a male heir. For the first 3 years of our marriage, that pressure was a living, breathing entity in our home. Every Sunday dinner at the Stewart estate felt like an interrogation. Margaret would stare at my stomach while sipping her Chardonnay, making thinly veiled comments about my biological clock and the Stewart legacy. I desperately wanted to be a mother. I tracked my ovulation with obsessive precision. I took every supplement recommended by every fertility specialist in Chicago. Every month, when the pregnancy test showed a single, lonely line, I would lock myself in our master bathroom and weep uncontrollably. And through it all, Alfeo was strangely stoic. He would pat my shoulder, tell me not to stress, and change the subject. I mistook his detachment for emotional strength, a rock for me to lean on. I had no idea it was actually the armor of a staggering, incomprehensible deception. When I finally missed my period and saw those 2 pink lines, I practically collapsed with joy. I rushed downstairs, tears streaming down my face, and showed Alfeo the test. I expected him to sweep me into his arms. Instead, the color completely drained from his face. He stared at the plastic stick as if I had just handed him a venomous snake. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile, muttered a hollow congratulations, and immediately poured himself a heavy glass of scotch. Over the next 9 months, his warmth evaporated. He stopped coming to ultrasound appointments, claiming work emergencies. He slept with his back to me. When our son Leo was born, a beautiful, healthy boy with a tuft of dark hair, Alfeo looked at him in the hospital bassinet with eyes that held nothing but cold, terrifying suspicion. That suspicion violently boiled over on a Tuesday evening when Leo was 3 months old. I was warming a bottle at the stove when Alfeo marched through the front door, bypassing his usual routine of loosening his tie and dropping his briefcase. His face was a thunderous mask of rage. Before I could even ask about his day, he slammed a crumpled white envelope onto the kitchen island. The paper slid across the polished granite and stopped inches from my hand. "Don't play dumb, Charlene," he spat, his voice trembling with a fury I had never witnessed. "I know." "Know what?" I asked, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I reached for the envelope, my fingers brushing against the logo of a private genetic testing facility in downtown Chicago. "I know he isn't mine," Alfeo shouted, gesturing wildly toward the nursery upstairs. "I know you lied to me. I want to know who it is. Was it a coworker? Was it someone from your little book club?" I stared at him in sheer disbelief. The room started to spin. "Alfeo, what are you talking about? Leo is your son. I have never, in the 5 years we've been married, even looked at another man. Are you out of your mind?" He let out a cruel, barking laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Stop lying. You can't manipulate your way out of biology, Charlene. I have proof. Absolute, undeniable medical proof that it is biologically impossible for me to be that boy's father." "What proof?" I cried, tears welling in my eyes as panic set in. "Did you run a DNA test without telling me? If you did, it will show that he is yours." "I didn't need a DNA test to know you're a cheating whore," he roared, the venom in his voice physically pushing me back a step. "I had a vasectomy, Charlene, 3.5 years ago, right before we got married. I had it done privately, under an alias, out of state. I shoot blanks. I have always shot blanks. So unless you're claiming an immaculate conception, you need to pack your bags and get the hell out of my house." The silence that followed was deafening. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify as his words crashed over me. A vasectomy. Before we got married, he watched me inject myself with expensive hormones. He watched me sob on the bathroom tiles month after month. He listened to his mother degrade my fertility and my worth as a woman at every family dinner. And he knew, every single second of every single day, that he was the reason we weren't conceiving. He let me carry the crushing weight of the blame to protect his own ego, because he knew I would have left him if I knew he never wanted children. The shock quickly metastasized into a blinding, scorching rage, but beneath the anger was a terrifying confusion. I had not cheated. I knew my own truth with absolute certainty. There was no other man. Not ever. I didn't cheat, I whispered, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. I don't know how, and I don't care what procedure you had done. I have never been with another man. Leo is your son. Get out, Alfeo sneered, turning his back on me. My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow. You won't get a dime of Stewart money. And take your bastard with you. That night, I packed my son, my clothes, and the shattered remains of my reality into my car. I drove through the pouring rain to my older sister Rachel's small apartment in the city. I spent the entire night holding my sleeping baby, staring at the ceiling, trying to solve an impossible biological equation. I hadn't cheated, but my husband had a vasectomy. One of those two facts had to be false. And since I knew my truth, I knew exactly what I had to do next. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Alfeo's legal team, funded by Charles Stewart's seemingly bottomless bank accounts, launched an aggressive assault. They filed for divorce, citing egregious infidelity, and demanded full retention of all marital assets, claiming I had violated the moral turpitude clause of our ironclad prenuptial agreement. Margaret Stewart wasted no time beginning her smear campaign, whispering to the Lake Forest Country Club elites that I was a gold-digging fraud who had tried to trap her son with another man's child. But they severely underestimated a mother fighting for her son's legitimacy and her own sanity. I didn't hire a polite society lawyer. I hired Catherine Montgomery, a ruthless, brilliant family law attorney who ate arrogant men for breakfast. The moment I sat in her high-rise office and told her the entire story, including the secret vasectomy and my absolute certainty of my fidelity, Catherine's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a shark smelling blood in the water. If you are telling me the truth, Charlene, Catherine said, tapping her pen against her mahogany desk, then Alfeo Stewart is about to experience the most expensive and humiliating medical phenomenon in the history of Illinois family court. We aren't just going to ask for a DNA test. We are going to secure a court-ordered, legally binding, chain of custody genetic test at the most reputable clinic in the state, and we are going to make him pay for it. Catherine filed an emergency motion to establish paternity, halting the divorce proceedings in their tracks. Alfeo's lawyers fought it, claiming a test was unnecessary given Alfeo's medical records proving his sterility. But the judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero patience for wealthy entitlement, slammed her gavel and ordered Alfeo to submit a DNA sample by the end of the week. The morning of the test, the air in the waiting room of the clinical laboratory was thick enough to choke on. I sat in a plastic chair, holding Leo tightly to my chest. Alfeo arrived 20 minutes late, flanked by 2 aggressive attorneys and his mother, Margaret. Margaret wore a Chanel suit and an expression of utter disgust, refusing to even look in my or my baby's direction. Alfeo looked hollowed out, dark circles under his eyes, exuding a toxic mix of arrogance and underlying panic. We didn't speak a single word to each other, as the phlebotomist swabbed our cheeks and took our blood to ensure complete accuracy. The wait for the results took exactly 9 days. 9 agonizing days where I questioned my own sanity, wondering if I had somehow hallucinated an entire affair. When the call finally came, Catherine instructed everyone Alfeo, his legal team, Margaret, and myself to meet in the neutral territory of a private conference room at the courthouse. I arrived early, wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. I knew my truth. Alfeo walked in looking smug. Margaret sat beside him, already pulling out her phone as if the meeting was a mere formality before they threw me out onto the street. Catherine stood at the head of the long oak table, holding a sealed, thick envelope with the clinic's embossed seal. "We have the results of the court-ordered paternity test," Catherine announced, her voice echoing in the quiet room. She didn't drag it out. She sliced the envelope open, pulled out the heavy stock paper, and laid it flat on the table. She read the final line aloud, her voice ringing with triumphant clarity. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. The alleged father, Alfeo James Stewart, is not excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo James Stewart. The silence in the room was absolute, total, and suffocating. Alfeo's lead attorney snatched the paper from the table, his eyes darting frantically over the medical jargon. Margaret dropped her phone. It clattered loudly against the wood, the screen cracking. Alfeo stopped breathing. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. That's impossible, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. It's a mistake. The lab made a mistake. I am sterile. Catherine smiled, a sharp, cold expression. The lab did not make a mistake, Mr. Stewart. We had an independent urologist review your medical records from your out-of-state clinic. While vasectomies are highly effective, there is a phenomenon known as spontaneous recanalization. In roughly 1 in 4,000 cases, the vas deferens can grow back together and re-establish a connection, entirely without the patient's knowledge. Your little secret surgery reversed itself. You are the father, and my client has been entirely faithful. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The fortress of his arrogance completely collapsed. He realized in that exact moment what he had done. He had falsely accused his innocent wife. He had abandoned his biological son. He had exposed his own monstrous, years-long lie about his fertility. And he had handed me all the leverage in the world. Margaret stood up, her face flushed with a violent, ugly red. I demand a recount. This is a setup. This woman has obviously bribed the clinic. Sit down, Margaret, I said, my voice shockingly steady, cutting through her hysteria. It was the first time in 5 years I had ever spoken to her without total deference. The test is legally binding. You wanted a Stewart heir? You have one, but you are never going to see him. Alfeo fell to his knees beside my chair. The wealthy, untouchable heir was openly weeping, grasping at the fabric of my skirt. Charlene, oh my God, Charlene, I am so sorry. I was terrified. I thought you betrayed me. Please, please forgive me. Come home. We can fix this. I looked down at the man I had loved, the man who had watched me cry over negative pregnancy tests while hiding his sterility, the man who had thrown me out into the rain without a second thought. I will never forgive you, Alfeo, I said quietly, pulling my skirt from his grasp. The divorce is proceeding, but the terms are going to be vastly different now. Catherine will send over our new demands. I walked out of that conference room feeling lighter than I had in years. I had won. My son was safe. My name was cleared. But the universe, it seemed, was not quite finished tearing the Stewart family apart. The paternity test had answered the question of who Leo's father was. But the raw data from that test was about to expose a secret so deeply buried, it would shatter the very foundation of Margaret and Charles Stewart's perfect, aristocratic lives. Power dynamics shifted completely following the paternity reveal. Alfeo begged for reconciliation, firing his aggressive lawyers and sending ridiculous floral arrangements. Margaret, utterly humiliated by the revelation that her son was indeed the father of the child she had publicly slandered, retreated to her Connecticut estate in disgrace. I ignored Alfeo's pleas, focusing entirely on my son from the safety of a sunlit apartment paid for by his temporary spousal support. However, at his 6-month checkup, Leo developed a persistent rash and a slight irregularity in his heartbeat. His pediatrician, Dr. Harrison, suggested a comprehensive genetic health screening. It's likely nothing, he assured me, but a full panel can identify any inherited cardiac markers. It requires raw DNA data from both biological parents to give us a complete genetic map. Desperate to prove his devotion, Alfeo immediately agreed. He paid out of pocket for an advanced whole genome sequencing package through a private genetics firm that also linked to major ancestry databases to cross-reference familial health histories. We both submitted our samples. 4 weeks later, the results were uploaded. After Leo finally fell asleep one evening, I opened my laptop. Dr. Harrison had already confirmed earlier that afternoon that the cardiac markers were entirely benign, so I decided to explore the portal out of pure curiosity. The dashboard was incredibly detailed. On a whim, I clicked the Familial Connections and Ancestry tab. I scrolled past my own side, confirming my expected Irish and Polish descent. Then I checked Alfeo's side to see the vaunted Stewart lineage. Because Margaret had forced her extended family to submit DNA to commercial sites years ago, I knew their genetic profiles were active in the global databases. I looked at the top of Alfeo's tree, expecting to see Charles and Margaret Stewart. The spaces were blank. Frowning, I refreshed the page, assuming it was a loading error. The spaces remained blank. Below them, the system had generated a list of Alfeo's closest genetic relatives. Match 1. Diana Croft. Relationship. Biological mother. Shared DNA. 49.8%. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the name. Diana Croft. Not Margaret Stewart. I scrolled frantically down the list. Match 2. William Croft. Relationship. Half-brother. Shared DNA. 24.1%. I typed Stewart into the search bar. 0 results. I typed Margaret's maiden name. 0 results. My hands started to shake violently. I was looking at absolute, irrefutable, mathematical proof that Alfeo shared 0 genetic material with the parents who had raised him. Given his profound ignorance regarding his own vasectomy, Alfeo was clearly a man kept in the dark about his own origins. I opened a new browser tab and dove into public records. It took 2 hours to piece together the horrifying puzzle. Diana Croft was a woman living in rural Florida. 32 years ago, the exact year Alfeo was born, she had been a 19-year-old college dropout working as a waitress in Miami. I cross-referenced Margaret and Charles. According to an archived Chicago Society magazine, Margaret had suffered a highly publicized third miscarriage 32 years ago. Shortly after, the article noted, the couple had retreated to their Miami winter estate for an extended private sabbatical. They returned to Chicago 9 months later with a newborn son, claiming Margaret had spent the entire pregnancy on bed rest under the care of an experimental fertility specialist. The truth slammed into me with the force of a freight train. Margaret had never been pregnant with Alfeo. She had faked the entire thing to secure the Stewart heir, likely paying off a vulnerable waitress in cash to hand over her baby. It was an off-the-books, illegal adoption, masked as a society miracle. Alfeo's entire life, his arrogance, his supposed blue blood superiority, and his mother's endless lectures on the Stewart genetics was built on a colossal, multi-million-dollar lie. He was the son of a Florida waitress. I picked up my phone and dialed Alfeo's number at 1:30 in the morning. He answered breathlessly on the second ring. Charlene? Are you okay? Is Leo okay? Leo is fine, Alfeo, I said, my voice eerily calm. But you need to come to my apartment right now. I have the results of the genetic screening. And tomorrow morning, we are driving to your mother's estate in Connecticut. When Alfeo arrived 20 minutes later, looking panicked, I didn't say a word. I simply turned the laptop around and pointed to the name. Diana Croft, biological mother. It took Alfeo nearly an hour to process the data. He went through the stages of grief in rapid succession, screaming that the portal was hacked, calling the genetic company's emergency hotline only to verify the data's absolute accuracy, and finally sinking onto my floor with his head in his hands. By sunrise, the man sitting on my floor was no longer the arrogant heir of the Stewart Empire. He was a broken stranger who had just realized his entire existence was a purchased commodity. Get up, I told him, tossing him his car keys. We have a long drive ahead of us. We drove the 14 hours to the Stewart summer estate in almost total silence. The sprawling, ivy-covered mansion stood stoically against the Atlantic wind. Using his security code to open the wrought iron gates, we walked straight through the heavy oak front doors without knocking. Margaret was in the sunroom, sitting on a pristine white sofa, sipping Earl Grey tea. Her expression immediately soured when she saw me. Alfeo, what is the meaning of this? I told you I did not want that woman in my house. Alfeo didn't yell. He walked over to the glass table, pulled the thick, printed stack of genetic reports from his jacket, and dropped them directly over her novel. The bold, black letters stared up at her. Who is Diana Croft? Alfeo asked, his voice completely dead. Margaret's eyes darted to the papers. The haughty, untouchable matriarch vanished in a second, replaced by a terrified, cornered animal. Her hand trembled violently as she reached out, her fingers hovering over the name that had just destroyed her empire. Tension in the sunroom was so thick it felt like it might snap the glass windows. Margaret's manicured fingers hovered over the genetic report, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the name printed in bold black ink. Diana Croft. The ghost she had purchased, paid off, and buried under 32 years of high society lies had just materialized on her pristine glass coffee table. "Where did you get this?" Margaret whispered, her voice stripped of its usual aristocratic command. She sounded small, fragile, and utterly terrified. "It's a comprehensive medical genomic panel," Alfeo said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Dr. Harrison ordered it for Leo's heart murmur. It cross-referenced global DNA databases to check for hereditary cardiac markers. Instead of finding a history of Stewart heart disease, it found a 19-year-old waitress from Miami. Explain this to me, Mother. Right now." Margaret closed her eyes, a single, agonizing tear ruining her perfect makeup. Before she could utter a single word of defense, the heavy mahogany doors of the sunroom swung open. Charles Stewart strode in, wearing his usual weekend tweed, holding a leather-bound folder. "Margaret, the landscapers are asking about the Charles," stopped dead in his tracks, taking in the scene. He looked at Alfeo's pale, sweat-sheened face, then at my icy, unyielding expression, and finally at his wife, who looked as though she were staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. "What on earth is going on in here?" Alfeo didn't hesitate. He grabbed the papers from the table and shoved them hard into his father's chest. "Read it, Dad. Read the part where I share 0% of my genetic material with the Stewart family." Charles frowned, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the top sheet. "I watched the patriarch of the Chicago real estate empire, a man who prided himself on his bloodline, his legacy, and his absolute control, read the indisputable proof of his wife's deception. His ruddy complexion drained to a sickly, ashen gray. His hands began to violently shake, the paper rattling loudly in the quiet room. "Margaret," Charles croaked, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. "Margaret, what is this? What does this mean?" Margaret buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, desperate sobs. "I had to, Charles. You have to understand. I had to do it." "Do what?" Charles roared, a sound of such profound betrayal that I instinctively took a step back. "Did you have an affair? Is he not mine?" "He isn't either of ours," she screamed back, dropping her hands. Her face was twisted in a grotesque mask of grief and decades of hidden shame. "Do you remember 1993, Charles? Do you remember the night after I lost the third baby? You stood in our bedroom and told me that if I couldn't give you an heir, you would find a woman who could. You told me the Stewart name couldn't die with you. You were packing your bags." Charles stumbled backward, collapsing into a floral armchair. He looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Margaret turned to Alfeo, her eyes pleading, desperate for a sliver of the blind devotion he had given her his entire life. "I was terrified. I loved your father. I loved the life we built. I couldn't lose it all. So I convinced Charles we needed a sabbatical in Florida to relieve the stress. Once we were there, I found a disgraced private physician in Miami, a Dr. Leonard Hess. For $100,000 in cash, he brokered a private, off-the-books arrangement." She choked on her words, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. "There was a girl, Diana. She was 19, terrified, and pregnant by a married man who had abandoned her. She wanted an abortion, but she couldn't afford one. Dr. Hess convinced her to carry the baby to term for a massive payout. I spent those 9 months wearing silicone padding under my sundresses. I faked the nausea. I paid Dr. Hess to forge the ultrasound pictures I showed your father. And when Diana went into labor in a private backroom clinic, I was waiting in the next room. The second you were born, Alfeo, they cleaned you, wrapped you in a blanket, and handed you to me. We drove back to Chicago a week later, and I presented you to the world as the Stewart miracle." Alfeo stared at her, his expression shattering. The profound psychological damage of her confession was visible in his eyes. His entire identity, his snobbery, his Ivy League superiority, his disgust toward my working-class background, his horrific treatment of our son, was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated fraud. He wasn't a blue-blood aristocrat. He was a prop, a human band-aid bought with dirty cash to save a failing, toxic marriage. "You bought me," Alfeo whispered, the words scraping against his throat like glass. I wasn't a son to you. I was an insurance policy. And you let me treat my wife, my innocent wife, like garbage because her pedigree wasn't good enough for you? You called my son a bastard? Charles, gasping for breath, pointed a trembling finger at his wife. You fraudulent, psychopathic monster. I am going to ruin you. I am going to divorce you and leave you with nothing. Oh, nobody is divorcing anyone yet, I interjected. My voice sliced through the chaotic screaming like a freezing gust of wind. All three of them turned to look at me. In that exact moment, standing in the sunlit mansion of the people who had tried to destroy my life, I realized I held the absolute, ultimate power. If this goes to court, I said smoothly, walking over to the coffee table and picking up the genetic report, it becomes public record. The legendary Charles Stewart, the Titan of Chicago, humiliated. His entire empire built on a fraudulent heir. The stock of your real estate firm would plummet overnight once the scandal hits the Wall Street Journal. Margaret would go to prison for the illegal trafficking and purchase of a minor, not to mention the decades of medical fraud. Charles swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to the papers in my hand. What do you want, Charlene? I want everything, I said, looking directly at Alfeo. Catherine Montgomery is drafting the final divorce settlement right now. I am getting sole physical and legal custody of Leo. Alfeo, you will sign over all your voting shares in the Stewart Corporation to a blind trust in Leo's name, which I will control until he is 25. I want the house in Lake Forest, completely paid off. And I want a one-time, non-taxable alimony payment of $10 million to ensure my son is never, ever subjected to your family's financial manipulation. Alfeo opened his mouth, but I cut him off. If you fight me on a single comma of this agreement, I promised, my voice lethal and steady, I will email this genetic report, along with the paternity test proving you falsely accused me of infidelity, to every major news outlet in the country by breakfast. I will burn the Stewart legacy to the ground. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, her old arrogance trying to surface, but Charles violently silenced her. Shut your mouth, Margaret! You've done enough. He looked at me, completely defeated, a broken king surrendering his crown. Have your lawyer send the papers to my office on Monday. We won't fight you. I looked at Alfeo. He was staring at the floor, weeping silently, a man who had lost his wife, his son, his parents, and his very identity in the span of a few weeks. Goodbye, Alfeo, I said softly. And I walked out of the sunroom, leaving the Stewart family to suffocate in the toxic ashes of their own secrets. Autumn arrived in Chicago with a bitter chill, matching the cold, surgical precision with which Catherine Montgomery dismantled Alfeo's life. True to Charles's word, they didn't fight us on a single demand. The fear of public ruin kept the Stewart family strictly in line. By November, the divorce was finalized. The Lake Forest house was transferred entirely into my name. The $10 million was safely secured in a diversified portfolio for Leo's future, and I held absolute, unquestionable custody of my beautiful son. Alfeo's descent was rapid and devastating. Without his identity as the Golden Stewart heir, he unraveled. He resigned from his executive position at his father's firm, or rather, Charles forced him out behind closed doors to distance the company from the liability of his fraudulent lineage. Margaret and Charles finalized a vicious, private divorce, with Margaret retreating in absolute disgrace to a small, isolated condo in Aspen, shunned by the Chicago elite she had spent her life trying to impress. But Alfeo had one final, desperate mission. Stripped of his wealth and his arrogance, he was consumed by a singular need to find the woman whose blood actually ran through his veins. Through a private investigator, Alfeo tracked down Diana Croft. She wasn't living in poverty, but she certainly wasn't living in a mansion. She owned a modest, charming floral shop in a quiet suburb of Tampa, Florida. She was 51 years old, married to a high school math teacher, and had 2 teenage daughters. Alfeo called me the night after he met her. It was the first time we had spoken in months. I only answered because I wanted to ensure he was adhering to the strict boundaries of his supervised visitation schedule with Leo. But when I heard his voice, hollow and exhausted, the lingering anger in my chest softened into a strange, distant pity. I found her, Charlene, Alfeo said quietly over the phone. The background noise sounded like a cheap motel air conditioner. And? I asked, bouncing Leo on my hip as I stirred a pot of pasta on the stove in my quiet, peaceful kitchen. She didn't even recognize me, he whispered, his voice cracking. I walked into her flower shop, and she just asked if I needed an arrangement for a wedding. When I told her who I was, she almost collapsed. Alfeo recounted the agonizing conversation. Diana had taken him to the back office of the shop, pulling the blinds shut. She was terrified her husband and daughters would find out about the dark secret she had harbored for 3 decades. She confirmed everything Margaret had said. She had been 19, desperate, and drowning in debt. Doctor Hess had promised her that a wealthy, loving family would give her baby a life she could never provide, and the cash would allow her to go to nursing school and start over. She cried. Charlene, Alfeo said, the sound of his own tears matching hers over the line. She apologized over and over. She told me she thought about me every single year on my birthday. But she didn't want a relationship. She said her family doesn't know. She said I was a ghost from a life she had tried so hard to bury. She hugged me once, told me she was glad I looked healthy, and then she asked me to leave. I closed my eyes, resting my forehead against the cool wood of my kitchen cabinets. Alfeo had gone searching for a mother to replace the monster who had purchased him, only to find a stranger who needed him to stay hidden. I have nothing, Charlene. Alfeo wept into the phone. My father won't look at me. My mother is a stranger who bought me. My biological mother wants me to disappear. I lost you. I lost Leo. Because I was so incredibly arrogant. Because I was too much of a coward to admit I needed a vasectomy reversed. Because I blamed you for my own flaws. You didn't just lose us, Alfeo. I corrected him gently but firmly. You threw us away. You chose your ego over your family. You let the toxic poison of Margaret's legacy infect your mind. You have a lot of work to do on yourself. I hope you find peace, but you need to find it on your own. I hung up the phone, ending that chapter of my life forever. Over the next 2 years, Alfeo strictly adhered to his supervised visits. He showed up on time, sober, and quiet. He played with Leo on the living room rug, brought him educational books, and never once overstepped the boundaries Catherine had legally set in stone. He was a broken man, slowly trying to piece together a new, humble reality. As for me, I thrived. I didn't return to the suffocating social circles of Lake Forest. I sold the massive, hollow mansion and bought a beautiful, historic brownstone in a vibrant, family-friendly neighborhood in Chicago. I used a portion of the settlement to start an educational foundation that provided private tutoring and scholarships for underprivileged kids from my old neighborhood in Cleveland. Leo grew into a brilliant, happy, deeply loved little boy. He ran around our backyard, chasing our golden retriever, his laughter echoing against the brick walls of our home. He never knew the crushing weight of the Stewart legacy. He never knew the suffocating, conditional love of Margaret. He knew only the fierce, unyielding protection of a mother who had fought the devil in a tailored suit and won. Sometimes, when I look at the legal documents locked in my home safe, the DNA test that cleared my name, and the genomic report that destroyed an empire, I marvel at the incredible, poetic justice of the universe. Alfeo Stewart had thrown a medical test in my face to cast me out in disgrace. He thought he was using science to destroy my life. He had no idea that the very same science would turn around and rip the foundation of his entire existence out from under him, exposing a truth far darker and older than either of us could have ever imagined. Did this wild story leave you completely speechless? If you couldn't believe the twists of this family's dark secrets, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends to see if they could have predicted that insane DNA revelation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more shocking, true-life drama stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Charlene's shoes?